I understand the history. Mitch started to realize, because of his own interest in Jungian psychology, that that human beings in general, and gay people as part of humanity, and also as part of our trauma, were not dealing with the shadow, not dealing with their own unconscious psychological motives. And the result of that is that all kinds of psychological bullshit and problems got acted out within the radical fairy movement.
But I brought some of my photographs. That is kind of my contribution to the day that I've taken during the 80s, just as a photojournalist, as a way to keep our memories intact. I've taken hundreds, if not thousands, of pictures. I brought 29 to share with you today, and at some point they'll probably end up here in the archives.
Gay liberation was about a decade old, and both of us were very concerned about the direction that gay liberation was taking. It seemed gay liberation starting as a liberation movement, starting as a revolutionary movement, starting about a people liberating themselves from oppression. We were slowly becoming desperate, afraid that there was no place where we could hold this gathering. We were looking for some place where there were absolutely no heterosexuals around, where there was no chance of anybody saying to us, you can't do that, or that's off limits.
You were just in there, huh?
Yes, yeah. And I mean, there was almost a kind of conciliatory gesture. Mitch's name was mentioned, but in passing, and not his whole body of thought or his consciousness about the vision he has about gay identity.
And when Mitch tried to name these things within the group, sometimes in very powerful and fiery ways, people freaked out because people don't want to deal with the shadow. They don't want to deal with the unconscious. It's terrifying. Jung says this in many different ways, that every encounter with the unconscious is always terrifying. Not every encounter, but initial encounters with the unconscious are terrifying, because it feels like an adversary when you encounter the transpersonal, something that's bigger than the ego.
But then Mitch advanced this idea that the radical fairies should struggle with that, and a great disturbance happened. Harry actually thought that Mitch was demonizing him. He accused Mitch of being a demon. So Mitch was able, actually at that time, and I know I'm giving you a really long answer to this question, Mitch was able at this time, I believe, I wasn't there, but from how I understand it, to illustrate to Don that actually this was the shadow of living color, and he got Don to see this, and it was very vivid, and apparently Don was convinced beyond all reason that this was a terrible problem. So Don and Mitch left the fairy movement to go pursue the fairy idea in a psychological sense, and they started actually a nonprofit organization called Tree Roots, which was in a way the psychological counterpart to the fairy movement, to the radical fairy movement, which is a very interesting history. Then, as you would expect it, then a very similar thing happened between Mitch and Don, where Don experienced the shadow issue and started to project that on Mitch. So
We made a circle, a grand convocation of fairies. The music ebbed, and quietly at first a litany of friends and guiding spirits were called forth. I evoke Walt Whitman, said one man. Marilyn Monroe, the next. The shadow of my former self, declaimed another. Other names came more boldly now. Peter Pan, Kali, our creator and destroyer, and so on until everyone was heard.
Let me just say it was immensely successful. It was a magical moment with gay men coming together, about 150 of us, and talking to each other. Talking to each other about the present, talking to each other about the future, talking about what our communities were needed, what was lacking in our communities, where we were going politically, and we had a time to be with each other sensually, erotically, intellectually, spiritually, and it truly was a magical occurrence, one of those moments, almost like Brigadoon or someplace like that, where just a moment ago it was here and then it disappeared.
He doesn't have much of a grounding in psychology, inner psychology, not to mention his own shadow relations at all. He doesn't discuss that at all. So I would say that he was actually fairly stuck in his own development, and that's a very severe problem. Now, one effect of that stuckness is that he, in his public statements about the fairy idea, has this tendency, whether it's overt or covert or intentional or unintentional, of completely erasing Mitch from the record, not to mention the ideas that Mitch was proposing and purporting about the psychological problem, the shadow. Don in his writing is hardly ever psychological, if at all. If he is, it's in some kind of cliched sense that anyone who has gone to psychology school would almost see as very superficial. It's not that full. Very rarely is actually Don gay-centered, with few exceptions in his public speaking or in his writing.
You know, we live in a culture in the United States today and in Europe where there are two genders, masculine and feminine. There are other cultures in the world that have more than two genders. For example, among the Navajo, based on Will Roscoe's work, among the Navajo, there are 4 genders. Gay men are known in the Navajo language by the phrase, "Though men not made for war, men not made for war." Lesbians are known in the Navajo language as women who hunt for rabbits. Women who hunt for rabbits, because we're doing things which are different than what other men and women are doing.
My lover right now is someone who's, was born in the late 80s. When I try to explain to him what a fairy gathering, what goes on there, what happens, what it's for, he wasn't really understanding the point. I was just wondering, how do you translate that or describe what being a fairy is, or going to a gathering, to someone who really has no knowledge or history of how it came to be?
I understand the conundrum. I understand the problem.
A reference point without it seeming, I mentioned, drugs or alcohol, and that, that's certainly a part of it, but it's not the focus.
I'll talk about it generally, and then I'll talk about what I've been trying to do for the last 15 years in that area. There's a West African saying that goes, if elders are lost, adults will be lost. And if adults are lost, youth will be lost. The problem around this is elders. The problem around us is gay men over 55 who have experienced some of these gatherings, who should be helping, organizing, and passing the knowledge on to younger people. We have an absence of elders in our community doing this. We have an absence of adults in our community doing this. The problem is not youth. The problem is elders and adults who are not assuming their responsibility and passing this information on to younger generations. Not just by stories, but also by organizing gatherings, so younger people can have an experience of being gay outside of gay assimilation, outside of heterosexual definitions of who we are. And therefore, I put the responsibility on elders, the men in this room, over 55, who are not doing their role in the community. You need to get activated. You know how to put on these gatherings. Put on a gathering for young people. Put on a gathering for young people and see if they come.